Hello, everyone. My name is Anna-Kynthia Bousdoukou. I am a journalist and IMED's Managing Director and Stavros Niarchos Foundation Dialogues Initiative Executive Director. I have the honor to moderate this panel discussion organized by ELIAMEP, Greece's leading European and foreign policy think tank, in cooperation with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, the Foundation for Strategic Research, and the support of IMED, which stands for Incubator for Media Education and Development. This past week, the eyes of the world turned to the United States, where one of the most critical elections in US history took place. Biden's win over Trump could mark the beginning of a shift of US foreign policy in a number of regions, including, of course, the Eastern Mediterranean. The Eastern Mediterranean has emerged as terrain of growing volatility, with Libya and Syria being plunged into catastrophic civil wars. Recent sizable natural gas discoveries present both an opportunity and a challenge. While Turkey is becoming embroiled in a wide range of regional conflicts, overlapping maritime claims and strategic energy interests merge old but also new frictions in the area. In today's discussion, we will examine what we should expect as the new US foreign policy blueprint in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we are happy to have with us leading experts in their fields to discuss all the above. So let me introduce the speakers. I will start with Ms. Heather Conley, is a Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia and the Arctic, and Director of the Euro Program at Center for Strategic and International Studies. So thank you so much. Mr. Francois Heisbourg is Senior Advisor for Europe of the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies and Special Advisor of the Paris-based Foundation for Strategic Research. Mr. Ian Lesser, Vice President and Executive Director at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and Mr. Loukas Tsoukalis, President of ELIAMEP, Professor at Sans Pro. I would like to welcome all of you and thank you once again for accepting the invitation to discuss this topic. I want to start this discussion with an initial 2 minutes comment from all of you regarding the US elections result. Will a Biden administration initiate a new era for the US as global geopolitical player? Ms. Conley, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me. What a great question. I have to say, I've really just been focusing on this transition period and being in Washington, D.C., we're sort of living this day by day. So quite frankly, I think we need to get through the next 4 months, make sure that there is some sense of unity of the country and as we move forward with President-elect Biden. I don't know if it's going to be as ambitious as a global plan. I see it as a plan of stability, of restoration. The challenge is the world has shifted dramatically over the last 4 years, and we can't restore to a pre-2016 moment. We have to actually build towards that future. So again, I see a restoration, a return of the United States to multilateral institutions, to some of the issues that we were engaged in prior to the 2016 election, but our ambitions will be checked because the work that has to be done is at home, starting with the pandemic, the health of the American people, as well as the economy.
Mr. Heisbourg?
Yeah, it's a game changer in the sense that we're going to lose Donald Trump, and I think most of the world is going to say good riddance to that. But I'm not sure it's going to be a restoration to the first 70 years of an America which based its foreign and security policy on an alliance system in Europe and Asia, plus a dose of multilateralism. The new US administration will naturally enough focus on healing a deeply divided society. Mr. Trump got 8 million more votes than the last time around. And that is quite something. And there will be plenty of elements of continuity between the Trump administration and the incoming administration. Continuity in terms of keeping a non-leadership profile in the non-Asian world, if I can put it that way. That began under Obama and was continued and accentuated by Trump, notably in the Mediterranean, where the US is basically only one player amongst many others like Egypt or the United Arab Emirates or Russia. And there is no particular reason why the vice president of Obama should turn his back on who he was 6 years or 7 years ago. And continuity, of course, accentuated in terms of the priority given to the relationship with China. That will overshadow practically every other dimension of American foreign and security policy. So the good news is that we're back to civilized discourse, cooperative relations. The bad news is that much of the substance is going to look pretty much like it did during the last 8 years, actually. Obama minus, I would call it.
Mr. Lesser? We cannot hear you.
I agree with most of what's been said. I mean, everyone has a view about this. It seems to be it's the topic of the moment, obviously. I mean, there are going to be enormous distractions, as Heather has said. But, you know, actually, I would posit that Biden, once you get past those distractions, and it may take a while, might be the most foreign policy minded president we've had since H.W. Bush, in fact. There are some others who have had foreign policy thrust on them, as the younger George Bush did after 9/11. Obama, for all of his policy interests, was not primarily interested in foreign policy. In fact, was deeply skeptical of the foreign policy establishment in certain ways. Biden is a much more traditional actor in this regard, much closer to the foreign policy elite in the United States, and it's sort of NATO-centric and other preferences. So I would maybe go a little bit further than Francois in saying that not only will the style be different, and it will be radically different, and that matters, but also, you know, this sort of inclination for activism, when it's given a chance, and there may be lots of opportunities in the Eastern Mediterranean, you know, would probably make itself felt in a way that we haven't seen in recent years, and maybe didn't even see under Obama. So that would be my assessment.
Mr. Tsoukalis?
Thank you. The answer to your question, whether we should expect a return of the United States to global leadership, should be, I believe, both yes and no. Yes, because the Biden administration is bound to be very different from the Trump administration, especially in terms of foreign policy. We should expect from a Biden administration to respect allies, to respect multilateral rules, to believe in global cooperation in dealing with global problems such as climate change. In other words, we will look forward to having a predictable and reliable leader of the Atlantic Alliance, not taking recourse to unilateral action. That is the yes part of the answer. The no part of the answer is, as has been said by fellow panelists, the new administration is bound to have to deal with enormously difficult domestic problems, from the pandemic to the economic crisis, all the way to trying to heal the wounds of a deeply divided American society. Furthermore, the United States administration will have to deal with a different international scene in which US hegemonic leadership is being increasingly challenged by other powers. So if people expect the United States to return to its old role as a global policeman, they will not have that. That would be my conclusion.
During, but perhaps even before the Trump administration, there has been a gradual US withdrawal from exercising strategic leadership in the Eastern Mediterranean. Do you share this observation? And is the Eastern Mediterranean region still relevant to the US interests? Ms. Conley?
Thank you. I do agree. And this, again, sort of capturing the threads through all of our presentations, this has already been a shift of US retrenchment from the region. Sort of our view was Europe must take care of its own regional neighborhood much more forcefully. I think this is where, quite frankly, the progressive left in the United States and the isolationist right sort of form together and say, we don't need to be the world's police. And to very much frame Loukas' comment, others must step forward. We're tired of doing this. We have to focus on home. The problem is the US still retains significant strategic interest in the region. And what we've seen is that as the US retrenches and Europe is unable to put itself in a strategic place and provide capabilities in the region, the vacuum that has occurred allows regional leaders that have real views about the shape and future of the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey, Russia, others, they are now intervening and creating facts and situations on the ground that then the United States and Europe must respond to, and the byproducts of their policies. Again, I see this as, and to Francois' point, this is not restoring. We can't turn the clock back. We now have a fundamental strategic realignment in the region that in some ways the Trump administration has supported. I think the Biden administration will build on it. It's this so-called 3+1 dynamic, which brings the United States in a much more intimate conversation with Greece, Cyprus, Israel. You have the Eastern Med Gas Forum, which is an even broader realignment and extension of that. And what that is perceived in Ankara is an anti-Turkish alignment. So we do have a significant new situation. The US does need to exert influence, as does Europe through NATO and the EU. But right now we're really struggling to do that.
Mr. Heisbourg?
Yeah, American retrenchment really began 10 years ago. The Canberra speech by President Obama defining what was called by the media the pivot to Asia. That was essentially at the time rhetorical and semantic, but as we all know, important things usually tend to begin with the semantics. That is now the overriding reality. It is very difficult to look at even the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, which we will get to, without taking the China factor into account, as we're already beginning to see with the follow-on to Turkey's successful war in Nagorno-Karabakh and the establishment of a direct link now between Baku and Istanbul, which fits in very nicely into the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, competing with Athens and Thessaloniki, if I can put it that way. Second date, 2011, the United States decided to lead from behind in the Libya campaign. And then, of course, the most important event, 2013, the Red Line crisis, where Obama decides about 4 hours before the planes were due to take off from US bases and French bases, Obama's decision to open a strategic void in Syria by not abiding by his own red lines. And in 2014, the Ukrainian affair, where the United States was clearly, obviously, highly involved, and I would expect it to be so as well under President Biden. But actually the donkey work on Ukraine has been done by Germany and the European Union. That is actually the centerpiece of the game, whatever its different dimensions. So this began long before Trump. And Trump, if I can use that expression, built on this reality, and Biden will find this very much as his legacy. I'm not sure the US will be tired in the sense of not having a foreign policy interest. In what Ian said is absolutely correct. Biden likes foreign affairs. And this is in other times, this would definitely have been a foreign affairs president. But from the standpoint of the countries which we represent here, what will cramp America's style is not simply the domestic priority, but it is the great game in China. It will not be possible to conceive of any US-European action and relationship without taking into account the China factor, which is why I dwelt a little bit on, for example, the consequences of the Nagorno-Karabakh war viewed through that particular lens. And that will be standard fare over the next years.
Mr. Lesser?
Well, I would agree. I mean, I take your point, Francois. I mean, arguably, we're coming for the United States to the end of what might be described as a 100-year pivot to Europe, in fact, for all the reasons you described. I mean, but of course, Europe is also looking to Asia for many of these same reasons. So the question then becomes, whether Europe and the United States will be on the same page in dealing with China. That's not our subject today. But I think, in terms of the Eastern Mediterranean, all the assets are there. This notion that somehow the United States is disengaged strategically from the region, has its limitations. There's a kind of mythology about this because, in fact, all the assets are there. We are, by a long stretch, the most powerful actor, single actor in the region, if we want to be. The assets are there. The diplomatic assets are there. The commercial assets are there. It's all there. Whether it gets mobilized in a strategic way is another question, fair enough. But of course, what happens is this gets tested when things go wrong. I suspect we'll come to that in a moment. But when things go wrong, as in 1996 over Emir Kardak, for example, we had a very dynamic Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Richard Holbrooke, who basically single-handedly brought the parties together and stopped what could have turned into a war. I'm exaggerating perhaps slightly, but you need those kinds of people, and you need a White House that's willing to give those people their scope. And I do think that when you look at Biden, maybe even quite different than Obama, there would be that scope. So I'm perhaps a little more cautious about saying that the United States is no longer what it was in the region. The world has changed. There's no complete reset. But if it's tested, I'm fairly sure you're going to find that the United States is more active and engaged than we might have been a few years ago.
Mr. Tsoukalis?
Well, my views are not dramatically different from those already expressed. I think it is fair to say that we have all witnessed a partial withdrawal of the United States from the region. Partial is the emphasis lies. And this began before the Trump administration. So I fully agree with Francois' analysis on this issue. The partial withdrawal of the United States created, in turn, a vacuum of power in the region. And the vacuum of power has been, in part, filled by two new powers, or one old and one relatively new. One is Russia, that has returned to the region. The other is Turkey, that is an old power under the Ottomans, but new in the more recent period in the whole region. Now, this is a troubled part of the world. Many unresolved conflicts, wars, local wars, civil wars, religious wars, wars by proxies. So one would hope that a Biden administration would restore the status of the United States as a stabilizing force. The missing power in the region, however, has been Europe. Europe's role in the region has been extremely limited. And us Europeans, this is the thing we're mostly worried about. I mean, Europe is constrained by a number of things, internal divisions, the unanimity rule as far as foreign policy is concerned, this unreluctance to recourse or to hard power, all those things. But Eastern Med is a vital region for Europe as a whole. So one would only hope that a more stabilizing role by the United States will be complemented by a stronger European presence.
Mr. Heisbourg, following to what Mr. Tsoukalis just mentioned, the European Union has a long tradition of centrating, let's say, on economic integration and ignoring power politics. Now that Europe is facing a crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean, we witness a lack of coherent strategy for the region. Perspective.
Yeah, it's a very important question and a very difficult one. If we look backwards for a second, well, we see that the European Union was simply not a strategic actor. Whatever your definition of the European Union is it the Commission, is it institutions in Brussels, is it the members of the Union agreeing to a single position? In practical terms, there was no EU strategy, even if the EU produced in 2003 and in 2016 so-called strategy papers. The Mogherini one in 2016 and the Solana one in 2003. But these were not strategy papers. They did not define a strategy in anything like what we usually mean by that word. But what have we begun to see over the last 3 or 4 years? And here's where it gets interesting. In 2016, the British had a referendum and decided to do Brexit. The British assumed, wrongly as it turned out, that the EU would not define a common interest and a common response to Brexit. Within a matter of weeks, that common position and that perspective were defined and have been held onto. And one of the key elements was that the EU's members decided that the interests of a single member, in this case Ireland, a small member, with 1/3 of the population of Greece, if I can put it that way, that the interests of that country were going to be considered as being more vital to the EU as a whole than whatever agreement we could reach with the relatively much more important United Kingdom. And this the British completely misread. We decided that there was an EU interest involved, which overrode the interests which one would normally have followed if we had been dealing in a purely nation state environment. And that's how Ireland managed not to be thrown under the bus, if I can put it that way. Now, we've had over the last 6 months, maybe the repetition of this kind of episode in the Eastern Mediterranean, and maybe with even more far-reaching consequences. And that is, remember, when things started to get hot with the Turkish drilling boat and the French sending their naval ships and their combat aircraft to Cyprus and to Greece and so on, the initial reaction of some EU members, notably Germany, was to look at this as a classical Greece versus Turkey bilateral problem, which maybe Germany and others could help mediate, but with Greece being pretty much put on the same level as Turkey. And over the weeks and months, it transpired, well, that maybe the fact that Greece and Cyprus were members of the European Union and that Turkey is not, somehow would lead the EU in acting differently. And this is, I think, what we have begun to see. The French pushed obviously very hard for this to happen. Greece also, of course, pushed very hard, but that goes without saying, given the situation. And when you look at the latest episodes, notably the Erdogan shouting fest against Macron, immediate statement of solidarity by the European Union as a whole, and more importantly, the notion that if Turkey starts taking commercial trade action against French trade with Turkey, then this is no longer a French-Turkish issue. It's an EU issue. And the French and the Greeks have started talking about sanctions. I'm not sure sanctions are the right response or not, but the whole affair changes in dimension. An EU in which it becomes clear that the interests of each member are viewed as EU interests and not nation state interests is going to be a very different European Union. It'll take a couple of years, I would guess, in order to see this consolidate, if it does consolidate. American attitudes will be important in this regard, by the way. If we have the functional equivalent of Madeleine Albright standing up as she did in '99 and to denounce attempts by the European Union to put together European policies, the 3Ds, damaging duplication, dangerous decoupling, and all of that stuff. If that's the way the Biden administration handles itself, that will be a problem. Conversely, and I get this from many of my friends, we all have many friends in the very large number of Biden advisors. I think the attitude is going to be a bit different. It's going to be, yes, let's work together. If the Europeans bring on the table European unity, well, that may actually be a force for the good. This is going to be one of the big stakes in the transatlantic discussion, which will be reopened.
At this point, I would like to ask you, Ms. Conley, what is the role of NATO in this conflict? I mean, the conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean between Greece and Turkey. Do you see, for instance, an increasing instability in NATO's southern flank? And how, of course, will Biden presidency affect NATO's coherence overall?
Well, NATO has always struggled with developing a strategy for its southern flank, in part since 2014 and events in Ukraine. There has been a bit of a tug of war between NATO members on eastern flank and meeting the challenges that Russia presents to the alliance versus southern threats, Islamic extremism, and conflict situations. I think in some ways there's been a quiet resolution of saying both. NATO needs robust capabilities on its eastern border as well as its southern border. But quite frankly, there has been such a glaring lack of capabilities that both the EU and NATO express, even when there is political will to send maritime forces to uphold the UN arms embargo for Libya or for migration problems. There is just a lack of maritime capability. In fact, NATO lacks a maritime strategy right now, which again falls into this significant challenge. But right now, I think the role of NATO is to prevent NATO members from having an incident in the Eastern Mediterranean, which we saw in July between French vessels and Turkish vessels. And again, this is part of the challenge, and this sort of rolls into my the next conversation we'll have about the role of Turkey, because in so many ways, NATO has had such a difficult time historically managing Turkey and managing the interests of Turkey, which differ from most of the alliance. NATO has tried the Mediterranean dialogue. It hasn't necessarily produced results that would perhaps be able to be a stabilizing force. So this is sort of historic challenges, but absolutely we're seeing in some ways, maybe it's fitting, and the anniversary of Armistice Day today, we're seeing continued ripple effects of collapsing empires, whether that's the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, in some ways French and British expressions of their role in Syria, in Lebanon, and the French, I think, reasserting in some ways their role to be a leading voice in shaping that region. Italy also entering this, and you don't have those mediators. The US hasn't played that mediating role. The question that we've also, tried to understand is, will a Biden administration be an Obama 3? Will it be much more hands-off? Europe, this is your responsibility. We have a major challenge in the Indo-Pacific. We need you to step up and do more, which Europe rhetorically acknowledges, but we haven't seen those capabilities put forward. Or will this be truly a Biden administration where you had a much more involved presence, whether that was trying to engage in Cypriot reunification, Mr. Biden working very directly with Mr. Erdogan and having those conversations, and toughening US and NATO policy towards Turkey and playing that mediating role. And quite frankly, we just don't know the answer to that. We don't know whether the personalities, the priorities, I think they will be more engaged. But these shifts have now created an environment where it's going to be harder and harder for the US to be able to influence outcomes. And NATO right now is trying to maintain unity as it looks towards a strategic reflection process that will have a list of challenges and a real challenge on capabilities.
Mr. Tsoukalis, how can EU-Turkey relations be stable while Turkey sustains tension with Greece, an EU member, and does not recognize another? Under the Biden administration, do you expect to see developments in one of the region's frozen conflicts, the Cyprus issue?
Okay, now, Turkey could be a strategic partner of Europe. And in fact, for years, it was treated as a potential full member of the European Union. This is no longer on the table, because under President Erdogan in recent years, Turkey has become increasingly an authoritarian regime internally and a regional bully externally. Is being perceived more and more by most Europeans as...
We lost you for a while. Could you please repeat your last...
Okay, I was saying that under President Erdogan, Turkey has turned into an authoritarian regime internally and a regional bully externally. Under those circumstances, Turkey has become perceived by most Europeans as more of a destabilizing force, even a threat for European interests, than a strategic partner. So that would be my answer to your question about EU-Turkey relations. Of course, I very much would look forward to an improved relationship, but for a good relationship and for a good tango dance, you need two partners, not only one, to play the dance. Now on Cyprus, we've been trying, many people have been trying and engaged in negotiations for decades to solve the Cyprus problem. And now we expect new negotiations to start under the auspices of the United Nations. But I think, to be fair and to be honest, the lack of a solution to the Cyprus problem for decades is not so much the result of a lack of interest or involvement of outside parties. You need both communities on the island to want to have a negotiated solution on a bi-zonal, bi-communal federation. And there, and I will continue to be honest, the burden of the blame and the responsibility not fall exclusively on one side. Did you hear me, or have I disappeared?
we had a few troubles with connection, but it's very clear what you just described. Mr. Lesser, does Washington, under Biden administration, of course, and Brussels have the necessary influence over Turkey to put an end to the dispute, or is it in the hands of Turkey and Greece alone to find a solution?
Well, I think our leverage over Turkey is actually relatively limited. I mean, it has always been an extremely difficult relationship, actually, to manage between the United States and Turkey. And it's very different than the European one. You know, for Europe, whatever the difference is, you can't escape from one another. Turkey and Europe, you know, share a lot of interests. They may have a lot of difficulties. They may agree or disagree. But in some ways, the societies, the interests, are interwoven in a complex way that is very difficult to take apart. It's political, it's economic, it's security, it's social, it's cultural, it's multifaceted. For the United States and Turkey, it's all about defense and security cooperation and foreign policy in a regional sense, but it's one-dimensional essentially, and more often than not, we disagree. And, you know, it's been extremely difficult. It sort of works in a NATO frame. When you get into the bilateral dimension of it, it's extremely tough. It has been particularly tough in recent years. It will be very difficult to repair this for many reasons. In fact, I would say there is a bipartisan Republican Democratic consensus about this in Washington that, you know, starting with the S-400 dispute, but continuing through questions of human rights and democracy and media freedom and many other things, which the Biden administration will pay much more attention to. That, you know, that Turkey has, there's a sense that Turkey is, if I can use the expression, simply gone off the rails under Erdogan. And, you know, so what can the US offer up? There's not a lot. There are things that we can tweak in terms of our policy towards the Syrian Kurds and other things like this. But frankly, unless something is done about the S-400 issue above all, and a more generalized concern about where Turkey is going with Russia, and by the way, the Nagorno-Karabakh developments don't help in that regard, it's going to be very tough. So my prognosis would be that the new administration will move forward very rapidly with a set of sanctions. I don't think they will be out to damage the Turkish economy in a way that perhaps Trump might have thought he could or would. It's weak enough as it is, but certainly things aimed at the defense cooperation, things aimed at official decision makers and other sorts of things, I think it's simply coming. So where is going to be the leverage there? It's very hard to say. Not a lot. There are things we can do, but it's fairly limited, to be honest. But I think you will see there is no longer a balanced perspective, if I could say, as there was decades ago. Greece, Turkey, Eastern Mediterranean, there was this kind of struggle for balance in American policy. It is no longer seen that way, just as it's no longer seen that way in the European Union, for the reasons that have already been discussed. There is a sense that whatever the merits of of the underlying issues, that the way it's been pursued in recent months and years by Turkey have simply been very destabilizing and extremely risky. And that, I believe, will be the perspective of the Biden administration. So they could weigh in on crisis management. I think they'll look to NATO to do a lot on that regard, deconfliction and so on. But in terms of actually, you know, resolving the underlying issues, it's for the parties themselves, it seems to me.
One more common question to all of you. How do you see the role of Turkey in the region and as part of the NATO coalition? Is Turkey's claim of containing Russian or perhaps Iranian influence in the region credible? Mrs. Conley?
Well, I think this is sort of, for me, and just sort of capturing all of the comments, President Erdogan told us in 2016 this was a new Turkey. We have to start addressing this as a very new Turkey with a very new foreign and security policy orientation that's captured in their blue homeland strategy. And they have been implementing that strategy across the Eastern Mediterranean and now Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think this is something that the challenge is we are doomed to manage the problem rather than solve the problem, but it's going to be more and more difficult to manage this growing problem. I rarely disagree with Ian. I don't think NATO can solve this problem because NATO unity is the higher priority. So again, it's easing tensions between NATO members. It's not necessarily addressing that we have a NATO member that now has a very different foreign security policy that works against Euro-Atlantic interests. There are, and again, just to re-emphasize some things that Ian said, Turkey has lost Congress on a bipartisan basis. And as much as the Obama administration may have been certainly stained by the 2013 Syrian red line crisis, the Trump administration has been strained by the S-400 red line crisis to the point of absolutely being ludicrous as having a threat that is never fully achieved, no matter how much the Turkish government keeps flaunting it. We are going to have to, I think, speak clearly, continue to work and bring Turkey back into a stronger Euro-Atlantic framework, but also acknowledge that Turkey may be loosening those bonds very specifically for that policy. So I think the best strategy for NATO and the United States is to do what they've been doing right now, looking at strengthening alternatives in the region, strengthening other regional strategic partnerships to try to balance Turkey's instability. I don't believe this will stop. I am extremely concerned about Cyprus, particularly because of the leadership change in the north that could present some different challenges. The fact that next week President Erdogan is visiting a very sensitive site, this nationalist need to distract from a worsening economic situation, to me, is terribly dangerous. And Mr. Erdogan believes Europe and the United States need Turkey more than Turkey needs us. And to this point, he has not been proven wrong necessarily. So this is going to get more dangerous, more unstable. And I think that's why it's incumbent upon all of us. The US needs a new approach. It needs to be a transatlantic approach. And we need to bring Turkey back into a strategic framework or prepare ourselves for a highly unstable situation.
Mr. Heisbourg?
Yeah, well, first of all, we already have a highly unstable situation, and it may well last. First, I'd actually start answering the question by asking a question, notably to our Greek friends. Last time I was in Greece, in physical terms, was last November, and I asked the political and military leaders whom I saw during my visit whether the security situation in the Eastern Mediterranean would be better or worse if Turkey left NATO. The unanimous answer I got, and it was very well reasoned, I would add, was we're better off keeping Turkey in NATO, despite Turkey acting against members of NATO. I wonder whether I would get the same answer today if I went to Greece. So that's a question I ask, and I'd be very interested in having reactions to that. Second point, of course, NATO was not created to adjudicate conflict between its members. And when a Turkish warship painted a French warship with its fire control radar, which is one small step away from opening fire, there was no way NATO was going to be able to deal with that. And it didn't, of course. In the olden days, the US would have done it, but as the US, not as NATO, 1974. Yeah. Stop this straight away in Cyprus, or you aren't going to get any more spare parts for your Air Force. Took 24 hours. That's basically over. I would also add that NATO's problems in the Mediterranean are not about capabilities. We have immensely more capabilities than anybody else has in the region, including Russia. No, the problem now is that we don't agree between ourselves what to do with these capabilities. Would it be easy to implement the arms embargo in Libya? Of course it would if we were all supporting the same side. But that is obviously not the case today. So we should stop this this capabilities language, which is perfectly correct for Eastern Europe. It's perfectly correct for the Indo-Pacific space, but it doesn't serve any useful purpose in dealing with the Eastern Mediterranean. Third point, one of our really big difficulties with Turkey is that Turkey forces us to ask very difficult questions as to what our own priorities are. Let me take Nagorno-Karabakh as a contemporary current problem. The Turks helped the Azeris, with some help from the Israelis, to beat the Armenians. This was a major setback for Russia. Is that a good thing for NATO? Well, if Russia is our problem, arguably the Turks have rendered a great service to NATO. This is not good for Russia. But if we ask ourselves the question, what is important in terms of Chinese policy? Well, yes, the Turks have become a major actor in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, and they are doing whatever they can to make sure that they're going to play the key role in that particular flank of the Belt and Road Initiative, short-circuiting the Greek end of it. How do we deal with that? What is the European interest here? What is the American interest? And is that question about what is our interest going to be the same in Europe and the US? I hope it'll be, but there's nothing predefined about the outcome of that particular discussion. I would have preferred to see the Turks get beaten in Azerbaijan, personally, both out of sympathy for the Armenian people, of which there are many in France today, survivors of the genocide. And also in geopolitical terms, I don't like to see China's hand being strengthened via Turkey. But I'm saying in effect, oh, we should have acted more with Putin on this one. Where does that leave NATO policy? And where does that leave EU policy? These are the kinds of really difficult questions which prevent us in any case from talking about a restoration in the American posture in the future. Whether Biden is activist or not activist, the questions he's going to have to answer are very different from those of 20 or 25 years ago.
Mr. Lesser?
I mean, thank you. I'm not the Greek to answer your question, of course, but I visit frequently enough to have a sense of what the debate is. I think most people would still answer that it's better to have Turkey in than out. But that's just what the mood you get in Brussels from people when you ask the question. But still, it's a fair question to ask. There's no mechanism, by the way, for getting them out in any case. But the issue of whether NATO can play a role in this, well, only in a very limited sense. Let me just clarify. I think just in the case of the deconfliction, the risk reduction, preventing accidents, preventing incidents, I think there is a role, and NATO in fact has played one already in recent months there, and I think it's very useful. But going beyond that, of course, it's very limited. On the question that you ask about, what is Turkey's ambitions and the sort of thrust of its geopolitics? Well, I mean, this is a complex thing, but clearly, I think it's an amalgam of this nationalist impulse, of a certain degree of political calculation internally, but not just that. I think there is a kind of broadly shared aspiration, and by the way, the opposition can be just as vocal on this in Turkey as the AKP government, to kind of cast a bigger shadow over the region, that somehow Turkey risks being contained in various ways, economically, politically, in security terms, that they have to push back against this. There's this rediscovery of the maritime vocation, which is also part of this. And then, of course, they've had a couple of very successful operational experiences using their military directly or indirectly recently, and that's emboldened them It was true in Syria, it was true in Libya, it's now true again in Nagorno-Karabakh. So, they've come back to using this military instrument in a way they used to be extremely conservative about decades ago. And so there's a lot that's gone together in all of this. And if you listen to Turks talk about this, especially Erdogan, you get the sense that what they're striving for is something that you could describe as a kind of non-alignment, that not all strategies have to be made in the West, that they can sort of go their own way. It's a bit of a Muslim affinity in there too, but it's a lot more than that. Our strategy in response to this, well, I think if just looking at the American side of this, the game here is simply to keep the transatlantic flame alive and hope that, Turkey's going to have an election in a couple of years, maybe even before that. There's an increasingly vocal and strong opposition in Turkey. We don't always share their views either, but he's not there forever. And, there will be a Turkey and a Turkish policy and a relationship with Ankara after Erdogan. And I think one has to keep an eye on that. In the meantime, it's a matter of hedging, frankly. And I think you see this in the American deeper defense relationship with Greece. You see it in other things. And those are the contours of American policy. It started with Obama. It's going to continue. It continued under Trump in a way. And will be, I think, at the center of what the Biden administration will have to do as well. So there are no solutions there, really, at least not near-term solutions. But I think those are kind of the contours of the problem.
Okay. Now remember when Mr. Erdogan became prime minister many years back, he had a foreign minister who had developed the dogma of zero problems with Turkey's neighbors. Now we've traveled a long distance since then. Now we have Turkey that has problems with virtually all its neighbors. So it's a big change. Turkey is behaving more and more as a regional power and also a revisionist power. There is an approach that I've often heard from Turkish diplomats that they say, approach to international relations is transactional. We take issues individually, separately, we have our interests and we behave accordingly. We are not tied by alliances long term. So Turkey can be flexible. It can be a member of NATO. At the same time, it can buy weapons from Russia. It can negotiate with Russia on some issues and be on opposite side with Russia on other issues. Now, you asked Francois the question, do Greeks still prefer to have Turkey as member of NATO? And I believe that not only my own answer, but the answer of many other Greeks, including military and political leadership, would be yes, on the condition that NATO and the European Union begin at long last to draw red lines. And this is precisely what has not been happening sufficiently in recent months, that there is a point beyond which if an ally or strategic partner of the European Union or whatever it is defined crosses that line, then there has to be a reaction. Because if you never draw a red line, you will find your lines withdrawing constantly. And this is a very serious risk facing the European Union and NATO. If indeed Turkey wants to play the regional bully and the revisionist power in the region, this is going to be a highly destabilizing force for the region as a whole. Now, I very much hope that this is not going to be Turkish policy in the foreseeable future. But if it continues to be, and the signs are there, then the Europeans and all our NATO allies have to draw their conclusions before it's too late.
Ms. Conley, what do you expect to be the future of the US policy toward Turkey under Biden's administration?
Thank you, Anna, so much. Let me just, Francois, I just want to respond very quickly to your capabilities questions. Let me be more precise. There's a total lack of political will to put forward capabilities, although I would argue German naval capabilities are so diminished, we still do have a diminished picture. I think, quite frankly, Europe is the unity question. In some ways is the direct issue. It masks the lack of political will, whether it's Operation Irini, whether it's other operations. It's just been a lack of focus on that. But let me just get back to the question at hand. You know, I think this is an opportunity, as all new administrations are, for a comprehensive review of U.S. policies towards Turkey. And this is very typical what we do. We don't have a great deal of time. It has to be done, I think, quickly. I would argue, if I was in the next administration, that a national intelligence estimate has to be conducted for all the reasons we've talked about. Turkey's foreign and security policy, its regional approach, its relationship with Turkey needs to be understood. Its relationship in the Middle East and as far afield as in Africa and Somalia. I mean, this is a large question that must be asked. We have to do a thorough assessment, assess what U.S. interests are in the region, and then shape a proactive policy, which I think we have seen that sort of accidentally be developed in some ways with this regional rebalancing of this anti-Turkish coalition. And quite frankly, I think President Erdogan is now bracing for this substantial change. I think what we've seen, the change of leadership with the central bank governor, as well as the finance minister, this is clearing the decks a little bit for a relationship that was very tied to President Trump and Mr. Kushner, and has lots of challenges with Hulk Bank, and it's not just the S-400s, it's the complexities of this relationship. So I think Ankara is bracing for change. I think there is a huge amount of interest in being tougher, but I think more purposeful in thinking about the region systemically, which has been lacking to, I think it was maybe Lucas's point, this transactionalism has killed us. We take every issue individually because, quite frankly, the comprehensive picture is really damning, and we have to start looking at this much more comprehensively.
Mr. Tsoukalis, is Turkey under Erdogan's regime a force of stability or a destabilizing factor in the Middle East? Should Greece's foreign policy towards Turkey change?
Well, I think I've already answered the first part of your question. Turkey, unfortunately, has become increasingly a revisionist power, and as a result, a stabilizing force in the region. Now, what does this mean for Greece? First point is that Greece should always be ready to engage in a constructive dialogue with Turkey, as with all its other neighbors, to deal with bilateral problems. And there's been movement in Greek foreign policy in recent years, and it's been a very welcome movement in Greek foreign policy. We have signed at long last a difficult agreement with what is now called North Macedonia. We have signed an agreement with Italy that delimits maritime zones, and we have done the same with Egypt. So Greek foreign policy has been moving. Surely, no doubt, dealing with bilateral issues with Turkey is much more difficult than dealing with all of those other issues I mentioned. So Greece should be ready to engage in constructive dialogue. Greece should be ready to engage on issues such as maritime issues, go ultimately to international arbitration in the International Court of The Hague. Are you listening to me? Yes. Have I disappeared or not?
Yes. No.
Okay.
We can see you and we can hear you.
Okay. Now, having said all that, there is a condition. And this is, you negotiate with somebody as long as this somebody does not come to the negotiating table with a revolver in his hand, pointing it at you. Because this is not a negotiation. Okay? So, negotiation under threat with revolvers on the table is not acceptable. So this is a kind of behavior that Greece is not and should not tolerate, nor should our partners in the European Union and NATO. So as long as our and hopefully again friends and allies, Turkey, are prepared to engage in a constructive dialogue and negotiation and agree mutually that we go on important issues like the delimitation of maritime zones to international arbitration, happy to negotiate. If they see that negotiation as essentially a way of bullying your neighbor to concede under threat, this is not a negotiation that Greece will engage in. And that would be my answer.
Thank you. Mr. Heisbourg, how do you see Turkey's future in NATO?
Yeah, all of what we've been talking about leads to that question, and you're absolutely right to pose it. And indeed, I'll bring my own answer to my own question, if I can put it that way, and that is, should Turkey remain a member of NATO? Of course, we all know that there is no escape clause in the NATO treaty, but there are many ways to freeze out, in practice, a member. And here I would be maybe a little bit more prudent than Loukas. It is worth remembering that Turkey is split just about 50-50 in political terms. Erdogan does not have a 75% mandate, to put it mildly. And the question then becomes, if we push Turkey out of NATO, and there are many reasons why we would want to do that, actually, what will be the domestic political effect of that in Turkey? And I suspect that at least at this stage of affairs, it would lead to a hardening via the patriotic reflex. Turkish people are very patriotic. And that their position, political position.
Mr. Heisbourg, could you please repeat your last sentence, since we lost you for a moment?
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize that. I was saying that if we were to push Turkey outside of NATO, we would probably make Erdogan's political position in Turkey stronger rather than weaker. He emasculated the armed forces in 2016, so that is not where he doesn't need, I don't think he needs to worry too much about that. He's not going to end up like Menderes in 1962. But we should not, to use a French expression, we should not insult the future. Ne devrait pas insulter l'avenir. The future of Turkey may not be Erdogan, if I can put it that way. That would be my own reason for not pushing or even freezing Turkey out of NATO. As to a comprehensive approach by the Europeans and or NATO, or the two together, vis-a-vis the situation in the Eastern Med, I would love that to be possible, but I fear that there are too many moving parts. The respective importance of what you want is going to differ from place to place and from time to time. Sometimes it will be the China factor. That'll be increasingly the case. Sometimes it will be the Russia factor. Sometimes it will be the Salafi versus Muslim brother factor. All of these intersect, but they don't lead to similar coalitions. They don't lead to similar identical policy conclusions. This is really back to the 19th century. And I don't know how well the US and the Europeans are equipped to handle that kind of degree of fluidity and complexity. I don't want to repeat what I said about Nagorno-Karabakh, but when you simply take the Nagorno-Karabakh thing and you try to define what is our overriding interest, it's very difficult to answer. Is it to help Putin, or is it to help Erdogan? Is it to help the Chinese? Is it to block the Chinese? Very complicated. And that is the wave of the future in the Eastern Med. The good thing that we have is that we do have the European Union, and the European Union has, I think, is in the process of building up a sense of self. That is, if a member of the European Union gets into trouble for no reason of its own, all of the members of the European Union treat the interest of that member as an EU interest. Now, you could say that that is actually a pretty good definition of NATO. Yeah, difference, of course, is that Turkey is not in the European Union.
Mr. Lesser, there is a development of an anti-Turkey regional coalition and growing Russian-Turkish tensions. Are you worried of conflicts escalating or emerging anew in the region?
Well, I'm worried, you know, Francois had it sort of right. I forget the expression you used, too many moving pieces. Well, there are so many actors. I mean, that's one of the big differences, it seems to me, between the kind of situation that we had up until the late 1990s between Greece and Turkey, and the Cyprus equation as well. It was a simpler, dangerous, but simpler equation at that time. You now have many more actors and many more moving pieces and many other things that can go wrong. We already talked about some of the very dangerous incidents that have already taken place between France and Turkey, but you can imagine other things happening involving Russia, for example. I do think that that's one area, another area of nuance, perhaps, but of difference the Biden administration might bring. They're going to be much tougher on Russia. And that toughness probably is mostly viewed through the lens of developments in the East, but there is a southern piece to this too. And I could well imagine a greater sensitivity to what Russia is doing in Libya, what Russia is doing in Syria, Russian presence in the Eastern Mediterranean generally, including in Cyprus. And that could be a real factor. But anyway, you've got lots of actors. China has workers and construction going on all over the region. If you think about this, 5 or 10 or 15 years from now, it's going to be even heavier. China will be a serious stakeholder, a security stakeholder, as well as a commercial stakeholder in all of this. They have some exposure here too. It's not all benefit for them, obviously. So as time goes on, it seems to me, with more actors, more complexity, a set of open-ended crises, because that's really what they are. I mean, does anyone really believe that Libya or Syria is going to turn into a stable environment in the next years? And by the way, to come back to Turkey, this is maybe the leverage that we have, because Turkey is going to have to live in this very troubled neighborhood, which they're very sensitive to, forever. They're there. They cannot escape from it. And they will have this kind of durable chaos on their borders for some time to come. Who is going to help insure them against those risks? Where are they going to get that? Are they going to get it from the Russians? I doubt it. The Russians could be part of that equation. They're going to get it from NATO. They're going to get it from the relationship with the United States. They're going to get it from a more stable relationship with the European Union. That maybe ultimately is the leverage that's there, but it requires a different sort of mindset in Ankara. And I'm afraid that Turkey is, in a sense, with the S-400 deal and other things, backed itself into a corner that it's going to be very difficult to get out of in the near term. But over the maybe medium term, we could have a different political constellation in Ankara that would be more alive to that need for reassurance of allies and deterrence against a wide set of problems in the region. So, yes, more dangerous, more brinksmanship potentially, but also some opportunities to fix things if we agree about them.
Mm-hmm. Additionally to all above, let's see the importance of energy. Mr. Tsoukalis, I would like to start this round with your answer in relation to the importance of the East Med in terms of economics and energy.
Okay, as we all know, we've discovered natural gas reserves underwater in different parts of East Med. the Egyptians in their maritime zone, the Israelis in their maritime zone, and also gas around the Republic of Cyprus. Now, of course, the stakes have become higher as a result. And many people in the region have begun to dream of themselves as future oil sheikhs or gas sheikhs. So they thought themselves getting extremely rich as a result of those discoveries. I would suggest to them to scale down their expectations and ambitions. I think the importance of those gas reserves has been grossly exaggerated by many people in the region and beyond. Let me just remind you of three factors that we have to take under consideration. The first is that prices of gas and oil are so low today that make drilling natural gas down from the sea in East Med totally economically unviable. And as long as prices remain low, this will continue to be the case in the future. I'm not suggesting that low prices will remain that low, but we may not go back to very high prices in the foreseeable future either. Number two, gas reserves in the region are far away from large consumer markets, which means transport is expensive and also militarily awkward because it goes through very unstable regions. And number three, let us not forget that we are accelerating as far as the European Union is concerned, and the United States under the Biden administration as well, I hope, we are accelerating our green transition. So in our green transition, gas and oil will be banned. So that means that all of us have exaggerated enormously the economic importance of gas reserves that many people are ready to fight about in the region.
Mr. Lesser, do you think that the energy reserves in the Eastern Mediterranean will be a source of further tension or opportunity for prosperity?
The short answer is yes. It's quite striking. I mean, many of the analyses that one saw, over the last months when the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean was particularly hot, featured, very elaborate maps and describing the kinds of resource issues that Loukas has just laid out for us. I don't think it's about that. That is not the problem. This crisis that we're facing, or a set of crises that we're facing in the region today, are not about energy, in my view. Energy is in some ways a pretext. It's interesting. It's important to consider from a commercial perspective. If you're in that sector, there are interesting issues there to talk about. But for all the reasons that Loukas described, for the moment, it's very difficult to monetize those resources. There are exceptions. The Egyptians are doing it, partly because they're able to plug in very easily to their own LNG network, which exists already. Turkey could be a very interesting player in this regard, because if part of the problem here is getting access to markets and getting access to infrastructure that already exists, because it's very expensive to build, Turkey could be an important player in that regard. But at the moment, it's very difficult to have bankable projects. And a lot of this is simply aspirational. So for me, I just don't think it's about energy. I think it shouldn't be a sort of casus belli. There's no reason for that. In fact, if you really want to develop these resources, the way you do it is through regional cooperation, because that's how you lower the price. The companies know this very well. And in addition to that, every increment of strategic risk that is added by this kind of aggressive behavior and responses to it is a further dissuasion to investors. If it's about developing these resources, it shouldn't be a conflictual future. It should be something else. But, rationality doesn't always operate in that way in these kinds of settings.
Mr. Heisbourg, what are the Eastern Mediterranean fronts that concern you the most?
Oh my goodness, that's going to be a very long story. No, I think we've talked about many of them. On the energy front, which actually is quite important, I agree with Loukas on the economics, and I agree with Ian on why cooperation would be the best way to go. But in practice, what is the gas and energy thing about? For Israel, it was about finally gaining access to energy under their control. This they have done. For Egypt, it is the same. It's not that Egypt is going to export oodles of gas. No, it manages now to actually satisfy its own not inconsiderable domestic requirements. It is a country of 100 million, even if it isn't a particularly rich one. Turkey has that same problem. Turkey's energy comes from other places. It is not under its control. And well, Russia is a frenemy, and so you don't want to be too dependent on Russia. Iran, well, there's for the moment no way of bringing Iranian gas to Turkey, and would Turkey really want that? So you would say, well, yeah, Turkey in its neo-Ottoman aspirations could turn towards its former Arab protectorates, like Egypt. It could cooperate with Egypt. Would make a lot of sense on the basis of what Ian said. The problem there, of course, is that you encounter another form of rationality, which is about political Islam. Turkey and Egypt are on the opposite sides of that particular divide. The sworn enemies of Egypt are the Muslim Brothers, and the sworn enemies of Turkey are the Salafis. And so you're not going to cooperate with Egypt. So what is your ultimate recourse? It is to redraw the maritime boundaries, gain direct access to Libya, preferably under your control, like in the Ottoman period, at the day of Tripoli, and his colleague in Benghazi answering to Constantinople. But that, of course, bumps into the slight problem of international law and the law of the sea and the Greek national interest and the European interest in the fate of Greece and Cyprus. So the energy thing is actually a much bigger disruptor than it would be simply on the basis of accessible resources. I completely agree with Loukas. Normally this should be a second order issue, but actually it is a first rank issue in the Eastern Mediterranean, along with all of the others that we already talked about.
Ms. Conley, China can be claimed to be building an economic presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, affecting, of course, the interests of the US as well as Europe. Do you see a shift in the US and European response towards China in the region?
Well, there's definitely a shift, particularly in Europe, and there's been a real consolidation in the United States, again, a bipartisan perspective about the challenge that China presents to the West. So I think that's the good news story here, and hopefully we can build on that foundation. I have to say the limits of my own research at CSIS, we have focused primarily on Chinese influence in the Western Balkans. We've just released a series of reports, particularly focusing on Serbia, which is a fantastically interesting perspective of how it's crowding out Russian influence, which is that a harbinger for things to come. But again, for my own research, really where I see China playing a more concrete role is seeing obviously Greece and the port of Piraeus, Italy, sort of that beachhead into Middle Europa, through the Western Balkans and Europe, getting those transportation routes. What makes Serbia so interesting as a non-EU member, though, is not only is it infrastructure related, which all countries are desperate for infrastructure projects, it's the digital wave that comes with these projects. So I think we have a great a foundation to build upon. The EU is very aware. I think the challenge has been because the Trump administration's tactics have been so self-defeating. We've pushed Europe to see its view as being a separate pole, just sort of that strategic autonomy, to be separate from the US, from China, from Russia, to protect itself, where we need to have a creation of a Western and democratic policy which combines Europe, Japan, Australia, the United States. We need a Western, a D10, a democracy 10 approach to this. So hopefully, but my own research has really been how the Eastern Med is really the transportation route into the middle of Europe, and it's a really fascinating story.
We would also like to hear a comment from the rest of you regarding China's role in the area. Mr. Tsoukalis?
Well, it is inevitable. I mean, the tectonic plates in the world are shifting. China is an emerging power and will continue to be so. There are things where we need and we have every interest to cooperate with China, like climate change. We have an interest and a need to cooperate with China as a trade partner, because they're a very important trade partner. But of course, we have very different views about democracy and human rights. And we may also have our own interests to defend concerning fair practices, unilateral measures, and so on and so forth. So I'm not one of those who will treat China either as just an enemy or simply as a partner. But one thing I would certainly not like to see is a conscious or unconscious return of the Cold War, with China replacing Russia, or the Soviet Union, to be more precise.
Mr. Heisbourg?
Yeah, so a couple of things here. Greece, of course, has positioned itself for reasons which were linked to the debt crisis nearly 10 years ago, has linked itself to Chinese investment, notably the renovation of the port of Piraeus. That has prospered. I saw that the Greek Prime Minister, Mitsotakis, just made a statement about how all of this was a win-win situation, that COSCO, the Chinese company which does the renovation of Piraeus, is a great thing. What I learned when I was in Athens last November, at the time of the visit of President Xi Jinping, was that the European Union was actually lending money to China, to COSCO, to do the renovation of the port of Piraeus, several hundred million euro. What's wrong in that picture? Well, I asked the European Investment Bank how this came about. And my answer, and I need not name the person involved, but at the relevant level, was, we don't, at the EIB, we don't do policy. The member states do policy. So here we are, funding Chinese investment. This is really weird. Why don't we just fund Europeans to do the same job? There is a bit of a problem here. The geopolitics can become very severe. Look at what happened with 5G. The Americans started drawing the attention of the Europeans about a year ago on the dangers of having Chinese companies control the foundation of our online economy, which, as we all know, notably through meetings such as this one on Zoom, we all know that the online economy is essentially becoming the economy. So dear European friends, do you want to be in the hands of the Chinese who have their own agenda? And the Americans continued by saying, oh, by the way, we're not in the game. You, the Europeans, you have companies which know how to do 5G. We don't. So why don't you ask your European companies to do this? Ericsson and to some extent Nokia. And the Americans were bloody right. And this is the trend towards which we are going. You look at how the 5G decision in the UK was reversed, how in France we're moving to a largely Huawei-free outcome. And this is going on elsewhere in Europe. Now, what happened with 5G under the Trump administration is going to happen every year for a number of decades in terms of American-European relations. We may not want a Cold War, but we are not going to avoid a power game between China and the United States of America. It's there, and it will be the overriding reality. So we're going to have to ask some fairly difficult questions here again. Is it in our interest to help the Chinese press their own investments and their own technological choices through the G17 in Europe? Or should we put in place a screening mechanism, which most European countries are now actually doing? But this cannot be a value-free and interest-free discussion. This is not a business discussion. China is a communist party-run country. It is not a larger version of Japan. It has ambitions, geostrategic ambitions. And Greece is going to have to think very hard about the future of that relationship. In particular, given also the competition which the Chinese are clearly fostering between Turkey and Greece in this particular arena. So this is going to be very tricky.
Mr. Lesser, I don't know if you have any answer on all these very crucial questions.
I certainly agree with Francois about the longer term challenge here and the fact that this is really a structural thing. We're not sort of going to get out of this strategic competition anytime soon. How it's managed, whether it turns into something more serious in the near term is another question. But and so all these factors that Francois has been talking about will continue to operate. I think as far as the Eastern Mediterranean is concerned and these infrastructure projects, I mean, not all of it is sinister. You know, we're going to have a debate about the merits of some of this. I don't really believe that things like the development of the Port of Piraeus and some of the agreements in Italy and so on are per se things that we should be deeply concerned about, but we're going to have to think about what the net effect of all of these things will be. And, you know, if the net effect is that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, perhaps, China becomes a much more direct security stakeholder in the region, we're going to have to think much more carefully about what their policies are going to be. At the moment, they're just sort of on the horizon in many respects, but they could be a much more direct actor if they feel that their interests are directly engaged. And of course, this Belt and Road, in a sense, at least politically, runs in two directions. They're now going to be exposed to all sorts of things. They're going to want to hold at arm's length, from radical Islamism to terror, all sorts of stuff. So, and we're not going to decouple from the Chinese economy. I think that's rather unrealistic. So we're going to have to weigh these things. But let me mention just finally one other point, which may in fact be the most significant implication of all for the Eastern Mediterranean and for NATO. If something were to go seriously wrong in the near term in the South China Sea or over Taiwan, between the United States and China, this would have a dramatic effect on American force posture, our strategic choices, how we would answer that question you started with in our discussion about whether the United States is disengaging from the region or not. And if you want a path to a future in which Europe is going to have to do much more because the United States isn't there, that's the way you get there. It's through that. And that's not an unrealistic scenario.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As we head towards the end of our discussion, I'd like to ask for a very short closing remark on all the issue that we are discussing today. What should we expect in the future? Ms. Conley?
Well, I would just briefly say what I'm watching is the interaction between Moscow and Ankara for this region and what it portends. And I think a particularly ominous comment on the Nagorno-Karabakh situation came, I believe it was from Kremlin spokesman Peskov yesterday, saying, you see, Russia and Turkey will manage this. We don't need the US and France to be involved in these issues. And whether that's in Syria, in Idlib, even Libya, there's a UN process. There's a sense of that decoupling from the West, the Euro-Atlantic community, that it is in those regional powers' interest to sort the region. And I think this is something that we must continue to watch as we move through this transition period to a new administration in January. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Heisbourg?
Yeah, it's a very important point which has just been made. Mr. Peskov, of course, has to find a way to dress up the very serious policy reverse which Russia has just suffered in this particular war. But he found a very clever way of doing it, and that is de-Westernization as a strategic good in itself. That is something which one can build on when talking with the Turks, assuming that there are people to talk with in Turkey. And that is, wait a second, guys, you're going to find yourself all alone with the Russians, like in the 18th and the 19th century. Did that go well for you in Turkey? The answer is no. So maybe there's some virtue in staying in NATO.
Thank you. Mr. Lesser.
Well, I mean, this has been a fantastic discussion, and you know, huge thanks for this. I think, look, I think it's a very negative development that this core détente between Greece and Turkey, above all, that has prevailed for 20 years or so, is frayed to such an extent. I mean, this is really one of the most sort of serious negative developments in European security in recent years, and one that has to be taken seriously. And it's going to produce real tests of the kind that we've talked about for the Biden administration, but also for the European Union. I mean, if the European Union, even with Biden, still aspires to a degree of greater strategic autonomy, if you want to use that phrase, this is going to be one of the places Europe is going to have to demonstrate it. Maybe it's the leading example, possibly. So I think for all sorts of reasons, this has been both a fascinating and important conversation, and it's certainly not the end of it. But thanks again.
Thank you. Mr. Tsoukalis.
Well, my conclusion in 4 points and in telegraphic style. The first is that I personally look forward to a Biden administration that restores the status of the United States as a credible and reliable leader of the Atlantic Alliance. That's number one. Number two is that this Biden administration finds in Europe a more reliable partner that is prepared to take a growing share of responsibilities and burdens within the Atlantic Alliance. Number three, the East Med is a troubled region of the world and is likely to continue being a troubled region of the world. So I very much would welcome both NATO and the European Union playing a stabilizing role in the region, but never forgetting that we are in a world where power is much more diffuse than it used to be, and it is no longer a Western-dominated world. And my final point that relates more to my own country, of course, it's a troubled region of the world. There are responsibilities for large powers outside, but there are also responsibilities for local actors. Now, Greece should always be ready, and I said it before, but I will repeat it before the end of the session. Greece should always be ready and prepared to engage in a dialogue with Turkey as long as Turkey is prepared to do the same in a dialogue and not by threatening. And we have an interest, and I am going back to the question asked by Francois. No, Greece has no interest in pushing Turkey out of NATO. Greece has absolutely no interest in shifting Turkey outside the Western alliance, because we don't want a border between East and West along the Greek-Turkish border. It is not in our interest. And we very much look forward to a Turkey that has a democratic government that is prepared to engage constructively with all its neighbors. And we should be ready for that.
Thanks a lot. I want to thank you all for this really productive discussion and the time you gave us today. Also, I'd like to thank ELIAMEP, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, the Foundation for Strategic Research, and IMED for organizing and supporting such an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.